I have learned that kindness, offered to a stranger on a cold November night, can bind you to the dead more surely than any chain. I have learned that some debts are paid not in this life, but in the liminal space between breath and silence, where ghosts walk and the living stumble, half blind, toward truth. It was a Thursday evening when I met Sir William Hartley, though I did not know his name then, nor did I know that by morning he would be dead, and I would be the only soul in London who could hear his desperate knocking. I had been to Mrs. Calloway's sitting room in Clerkenwell, one of those dim, incense-thickened parlors where grief and hope gather in equal measure around a table draped in black velvet. I went because I was a widow, and widows are expected to seek the dead. I went because 3 years had passed since my husband Thomas fell from the scaffolding at the railway works, and I still did not understand why a man with such steady hands and such careful eyes would slip. I went because I could not stop going, even though I had long ceased to believe that Mrs. Calloway, with her theatrical trembling and her vague pronouncements, could truly reach across the veil. The session had been like all the others. Mrs. Calloway's fingers had grown cold in mine. Her eyelids had fluttered, and she had spoken in a voice not quite her own about a presence, a man, a message obscured by static and sorrow. She had said the name John, or perhaps James, and I had felt the familiar twist of disappointment in my chest because my Thomas had never been called anything but Thomas, and if he were truly there, he would have found a way to make that clear. I had paid my shilling and left quietly, pulling my threadbare cloak tight against the November wind that sighed through the narrow streets of Clerkenwell like a living thing. The fog had come in thick that evening, the kind that turns London into a city of ghosts even before the dead arrive to claim it. I could scarcely see 3 feet ahead as I walked toward the omnibus stop on Gray's Inn Road, my boots clicking softly on the wet cobblestones, the gas lamps glowing like drowned moons in the murk. I was thinking of nothing in particular, or perhaps I was thinking of everything, the way a mind does when it is weary and alone. I was thinking of the manuscript I needed to finish copying by Monday, the careful, cramped script of a treatise on moral philosophy that paid me £3 and kept me fed for another fortnight. I was thinking of the cold that had begun to settle into my small apartment in Bloomsbury, and whether I could afford another scuttle of coal. I was thinking, as I always thought, of Thomas, and of the way his absence had become a constant companion, more faithful than any living man. It was then that I heard the sound. A stumble, a scrape of boot on stone, a low, pained exhalation. I stopped, peering into the fog, my heart quickening in the way it does when one senses distress but cannot yet see its shape. The street was empty, or seemed to be, save for the distant clatter of a hansom cab somewhere to the south and the faint, mournful call of a foghorn from the river. I took a step forward, and then another, and then I saw him. He was an old man, perhaps 70, perhaps older, with a face lined and distinguished, the kind of face that speaks of breeding and education, and a life lived largely indoors. He wore a long black overcoat of fine wool, a silk cravat, and a top hat that sat slightly askew on his white hair. He was leaning heavily against a lamp-post, one gloved hand pressed to his chest, his breath coming in short, labored gasps. His eyes, when they met mine, were a pale, startling blue, and filled with something I could not quite name. Fear, perhaps, or resignation. I approached him quickly, my earlier weariness forgotten. Instinct, or perhaps training from my brief time as a vicar's daughter before my marriage, had taught me to move towards suffering rather than away from it. I spoke softly, as one does to a wounded creature. "Forgive me, sir," I said. "Are you unwell? May I assist you?" He looked at me for a long moment, his breathing still ragged, and I thought he might refuse. Men of his class, I knew, did not often welcome the aid of women like me. Women in worn cloaks and mended gloves who lived in rented rooms and worked for their bread. But then he nodded very slightly, and his voice when it came was cultured and strained. "I fear I am, madam. I fear I am rather more unwell than I had anticipated." I glanced up and down the street, but there was no one, no cab, no constable, only the fog and the silence and the hiss of the gas lamp above us. I made a decision then, the kind of decision that seems small in the moment, but that alters the course of everything that follows. I placed my hand gently on his arm. "Where do you live, sir? I shall walk you home." He hesitated, his eyes searching my face as though trying to assess whether I could be trusted, or perhaps whether I could bear what he was about to say. "Mayfair," he said at last, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Berkeley Square. But it is too far, madam. You should not trouble yourself. It is already too late." I did not know what he meant by too late. I assumed he spoke of the hour, which was indeed growing late, nearly 9 o'clock, or perhaps of his health, which was clearly failing. I shook my head firmly, adopting the brisk, competent tone I had learned from my mother, who had been a nurse before she married. "Nonsense," I said. "Mayfair is not so far, and I cannot in good conscience leave you here. Come, sir, lean on me." He did, and together we began to walk. His weight was greater than I had expected, and I felt the tremor in his limbs, the way his steps faltered every few paces as though his body were betraying him. We moved slowly through the fog, the world reduced to the small circle of visibility around us, the sound of our footsteps and his labored breathing the only proof that we existed at all. I asked him his name, and after a pause he told me, "Sir William Hartley." I told him mine, Eleanor Ashford, and he repeated it softly, as though committing it to memory. We did not speak much after that. He seemed to need all his strength simply to keep moving, and I did not wish to exhaust him further with conversation. But once, as we crossed into the broader streets of Holborn, he stopped and turned to me, his face pale and drawn in the gaslight. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, and there was a strange urgency in his voice. "I must tell you something. I must warn you." I waited, my hand still supporting his elbow, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. "What is it, sir?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again, and I saw a spasm of pain cross his features. He shook his head, as though arguing with himself. "No," he said finally. "No, it is too late for that as well. But you are kind, Mrs. Ashford, kinder than I deserve. You must promise me something." "I will if I can," I said, though unease was beginning to prickle at the base of my spine. "If something should happen to me," he said, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that was almost frightening. "If you should hear that I have died, do not believe everything you are told. There are those who would prefer certain truths remain hidden. There are those who would call an experiment a murder and a murder an accident, simply to preserve their own comfort." I did not understand. I told him so as gently as I could. "Sir William," I said, "you are unwell, and you are speaking in riddles. Let us get you home, and then you may rest, and tomorrow you will feel clearer." He smiled then, a sad, weary smile that made him look suddenly much older. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps not." We continued on, through the elegant streets of Bloomsbury, and into the wider avenues that led toward Mayfair. The houses grew larger, the streets quieter, the fog somehow thicker and more secretive. When at last we arrived at Berkeley Square, he directed me to a tall, narrow townhouse with a black lacquered door and brass fittings that gleamed even in the dim light. I helped him up the steps, and he fumbled for his key with shaking hands. I steadied him, and he managed to unlock the door, pushing it open to reveal a darkened hallway beyond. "Thank you, Mrs. Ashford," he said, and his voice was firmer now, as though crossing his own threshold had given him some measure of strength. "You are a woman of rare compassion. I shall not forget it." I smiled, relieved that I had managed to see him safely home. "Rest well, sir," I said, "and if you are still unwell in the morning, do send for your physician." He nodded, but he did not step inside. Instead, he looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in his pale eyes. Sorrow, I thought, or guilt. "You should not have come here," he said softly. "You should not have involved yourself. I am sorry, Mrs. Ashford. Truly, I am sorry." Before I could ask what he meant, he stepped back into the shadows of his house and closed the door. I stood there on the step for a moment, staring at the black wood, feeling the cold seep through my cloak and into my bones. I told myself that he was simply an old man, ill and confused, and that his strange words meant nothing. I told myself that I had done a good deed, and that I should be glad of it, and that I should go home now and sleep, and forget the whole peculiar encounter. I walked back through Mayfair and into the familiar, shabby streets of Bloomsbury, my mind turning over Sir William's words like a puzzle I could not quite solve. The fog had begun to lift slightly, and the moon appeared in brief, ghostly glimpses between the clouds. By the time I reached my apartment on Gower Street, it was past 10 o'clock, and I was bone-tired. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my door, fumbled with my own key, and stepped into the small, cold rooms that had been my home since Thomas died. I did not light a fire. I could not afford to burn coal at night, not in November, not when winter was still ahead. I undressed in the dark, pulling on my nightgown and my woolen shawl, and crawled into bed beneath the 2 thin blankets that were all I had. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the building settling around me, the creak of floorboards, the distant cough of a neighbor, the rattle of wind against the window. I thought of Sir William, alone in his grand house in Mayfair, and I hoped that he was resting, that whatever illness had taken hold of him would pass by morning. I thought of Thomas, as I always did before sleep, and I whispered his name into the darkness as though he might hear me. I thought of Mrs. Calloway and her incense and her cold fingers, and I wondered why I kept going back when I knew it was all performance, all smoke and theater and empty promises. I must have slept, though I do not remember sleeping. I remember only the sudden, jarring return to consciousness, the way my eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness, my heart pounding as though I had been running, and then I heard it, the sound that had woken me, knocking, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my door. I lay very still, my breath caught in my throat, my mind racing. It was barely dawn. I could see the faintest gray light beginning to seep through the gap in my curtains, but the room was still dark, the building still silent. No one should have been at my door at this hour. No one ever came to my door at this hour. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, measured and insistent, neither angry nor urgent, but relentless. I sat up slowly, my hands trembling, and reached for the shawl I had left at the foot of the bed. I wrapped it around my shoulders and stood, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor. I crossed to the door, my pulse hammering in my ears, and pressed my ear against the wood. I heard nothing. No breathing, no footsteps, no sound of life on the other side. "Who is there?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and strange in the silence. No answer. I waited, my hand hovering over the latch, every instinct telling me not to open the door, not to let in whatever waited beyond. But I am not a woman who frightens easily, or perhaps I am simply a woman who has learned that fear accomplishes nothing. I took a breath, steadied myself, and pulled the door open. The landing was empty, or so I thought, for the space of 1 heartbeat. And then I saw him. Sir William Hartley stood before me, but he was not as he had been the night before. He was pale, impossibly pale, his face waxen and drawn, his eyes wide and filled with a terrible, desperate urgency. His clothes were the same, the black overcoat, the silk cravat, but there was something wrong about them, something that did not quite fit the light or the air. And then I understood, with a cold, creeping horror that spread through my chest like ice. I could see through him. Not completely. Not so much that he was transparent, but enough that I could make out the faint outline of the wall behind him, the shadow of the staircase railing through his chest. He was there, and he was not there, and my mind could not reconcile the 2 truths. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, and his voice was the same cultured, weary voice I had heard the night before, but it seemed to come from very far away, as though filtered through water or fog. "Mrs. Ashford, you must help me. Please. You are the only one who can see me. You are the only one who can hear." I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. I tried to step back, but my legs would not obey me. I could only stand there, frozen, staring at the impossible figure before me, at the ghost of the man I had walked home through the fog. "I am dead," he said, and there was such anguish in his voice that it cut through my shock like a blade. "I was murdered last night, Mrs. Ashford, not an hour after you left me, and I cannot rest. I cannot leave this world until the truth is known, until justice is done. You must help me. Please, you must help me find my killer." And then, before I could speak, before I could move or scream or run, he was gone. Not fading, not drifting away, but simply gone, vanished as though he had never been there at all. I was left alone on the landing, in my nightgown and my shawl, my hand still gripping the edge of the door, my mind spinning with impossible thoughts. I stepped back into my room and closed the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the latch. I leaned against the wood, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and I told myself it was a dream, a waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and grief, and too many nights spent chasing ghosts that did not exist. But I knew, even as I thought it, that it was not a dream. I knew because I could still feel the cold that had radiated from him, a cold that had nothing to do with November or fog or the unheated rooms of Bloomsbury. I knew because I had seen the desperation in his pale eyes, and I had heard the truth in his voice. Sir William Hartley was dead, and somehow, impossibly, I was the only one who could hear him. I sank down onto the edge of my bed, my mind racing, my heart still pounding. I did not know what to do. I did not know whether to go to the police, to tell them that a man I had met the night before was now a ghost at my door, begging for help. I did not know whether to return to his house in Mayfair, to confirm what he had said, to see if there was any truth in his claim of murder. I sat there as the gray light grew stronger, as the sounds of morning began to stir in the building around me, and I made a decision. I would go to Berkeley Square. I would find out what had happened to Sir William Hartley, and if he was truly dead, if he had truly been murdered, then I would discover who had done it. Not because I believed in ghosts, not because I thought the dead could return and knock on doors and beg for justice, but because I had walked him home, because I had been kind to him in his final hours, and because I could not bear the thought that I might have left him to die alone. It was the least I could do, and it was, I thought, the only way I might ever find peace again, myself. I did not go to Berkeley Square immediately. I sat in my small room as the morning light grew stronger, turning the gray walls pale gold, and I tried to convince myself that what I had seen was impossible. Ghosts did not exist. The dead did not return. I had spent 3 years attending seances precisely because I knew this to be true, because I knew that Thomas was gone and would not come back, no matter how desperately I wished it. And yet I could not deny what I had witnessed. I could not explain away the translucent figure on my landing, the cold that had emanated from him, the voice that had spoken my name with such terrible urgency. I dressed carefully, as though armor could be fashioned from worn wool and mended gloves. I chose my best gown, a dark green merino that had been my Sunday dress before Thomas died, now faded but still respectable. I pinned my hair with particular care, smoothed my collar, and told myself that I was simply going to pay a call of inquiry, to assure myself that Sir William Hartley had recovered from his illness. It was a reasonable thing to do, a Christian thing to do. There was nothing strange about it. But my hands shook as I buttoned my boots, and I could not quite meet my own eyes in the small mirror above my washstand. I left my apartment just after 8 o'clock, when the streets were beginning to fill with the morning traffic of omnibuses and carts and hurrying clerks. I walked quickly, my breath misting in the cold air, my mind turning over possibilities like stones. Perhaps Sir William had been delirious when he came to my door. Perhaps I had been dreaming after all, and the whole encounter had been nothing more than a trick of exhausted sleep. Perhaps when I arrived at Berkeley Square, I would find him alive and well, bewildered by my concern, but touched by my thoughtfulness. I clung to these possibilities as I walked, even though I did not quite believe them. Mayfair in the morning was a different world from the fog-shrouded labyrinth I had navigated the night before. The wide streets were clean and quiet, lined with elegant townhouses whose windows gleamed with polished glass. Servants moved purposefully along the pavement, carrying parcels and messages, their livery crisp and their expressions carefully neutral. A few carriages passed, their wheels crunching softly on the gravel, their occupants hidden behind drawn curtains. It was a world of order and wealth and carefully maintained appearances, and I felt acutely aware of my own shabby dress, my worn cloak, the way my boots were scuffed despite my efforts to polish them. I found Sir William's house easily. The black door, the brass fittings, the narrow elegance of the facade. It looked exactly as it had the night before, except that now, in daylight, I could see the small details I had missed. The iron railings were freshly painted. The steps were swept clean. A bay tree in a terracotta pot stood beside the door, its leaves dark and glossy. Everything spoke of care and money, and a household run with precision. I climbed the steps and lifted the brass knocker, my heart beginning to beat faster. I did not know what I would say. I had not planned my words. I let the knocker fall twice, the sound echoing hollowly in the quiet street, and then I waited. Footsteps approached from within, measured and unhurried. The door opened, and a man stood before me. He was perhaps 50, with graying hair and a stern, impassive face. He wore the black coat and white gloves of a butler, and his eyes swept over me with the kind of assessment that servants of great houses perfect over years of service. I saw myself reflected in his gaze, a woman of no particular consequence, dressed respectably but not fashionably, calling at an hour that was neither late enough for formal visits nor early enough for urgent business. "Yes?" he said, and his voice was cool and correct. I cleared my throat. "I wish to inquire after Sir William Hartley," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I had the pleasure of assisting him last evening when he was taken ill, and I wanted to assure myself that he had recovered." The butler's expression did not change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, a tightening, a hesitation. "I am very sorry, madam," he said, and his voice was formal, but not unkind. "Sir William passed away during the night. The household is in mourning." The words landed like stones in my chest, even though I had known, somewhere deep in the part of me that had seen the ghost on my landing, that this would be the answer. Still, hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that visions and cold air and desperate voices could not. I felt my face go pale, and I had to grip the iron railing beside me to steady myself. "I am so sorry," I managed to say. "I had no idea." He seemed unwell, but I did not think. I did not realize. The butler's expression softened very slightly. "It was his heart, madam. The physician said it was very sudden. He likely felt little pain." I nodded, though I did not believe him. I remembered the way Sir William had clutched his chest, the labored breathing, the pallor of his face. I remembered his strange words on the doorstep, the way he had apologized, the warning he had tried to give. There are those who would call an experiment a murder, and a murder an accident. "May I ask," I said carefully, "who the physician was? I would like to write a note of condolence, and I thought perhaps he might wish to know that Sir William was not alone in his final hours." The butler hesitated, and I saw him weighing propriety against compassion. "Dr. James Hartley attended him," he said at last. "Sir William's nephew. He resides here as well, madam, and has taken charge of the arrangements." "Dr. Hartley," I repeated, committing the name to memory. "Would it be possible to speak with him? I shall only take a moment of his time." The butler looked as though he wished to refuse, but something in my face, perhaps the genuine distress I felt, made him pause. "If you will wait here, madam," he said, "I shall inquire." He closed the door, leaving me on the step. I stood there, my hands folded, my mind racing. Dr. James Hartley, the nephew, the physician who had been with Sir William in his final hours, the man who, according to the ghost that had knocked at my door, might also be his murderer. I did not have long to wait. The door opened again, and the butler stepped aside to admit me. "Dr. Hartley will see you in the library, madam," he said. "Please follow me." I stepped into the house, and I was immediately struck by the contrast between the elegant exterior and the strangely cold interior. The hallway was grand, with a high ceiling and a staircase that curved upward into shadow, but it was dim and silent, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax and something else, something faintly medicinal that I could not quite identify. The butler led me past closed doors, past a drawing room draped in holland covers, and into a large room lined floor to ceiling with books. The library was warmer than the hallway, lit by a fire that crackled in the grate, and by the pale November sunlight that streamed through tall windows overlooking a small garden. The walls were dark mahogany, the shelves crammed with volumes in leather and cloth, and in the center of the room stood a large desk covered in papers and instruments I did not recognize. Glass vials, metal devices with wires and coils, diagrams sketched in ink, all scattered across the surface as though someone had been working late into the night and had not bothered to tidy away the evidence. And standing beside the desk, his back to me, was a man. He turned as I entered, and I felt my breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something far more dangerous. Dr. James Hartley was perhaps 35, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead and eyes so dark they were almost black. His face was angular and handsome in the way of men who spend too much time thinking and not enough time sleeping, with shadows beneath his eyes and a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile. He wore morning clothes, a black coat and waistcoat, but they were rumpled, and his collar was slightly loosened, as though he had dressed in haste or had not slept at all. He looked at me, and I felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, assessing and intelligent and utterly without warmth. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, and his voice was low and precise, the kind of voice that belonged to lecture halls and operating theaters. "My butler tells me you were with my uncle last evening." "I was," I said, finding my voice. "I met Sir William near Clerkenwell. He was unwell, and I insisted on seeing him home. I wanted to assure myself that he had recovered, but your butler has informed me that he has passed. I am deeply sorry for your loss." Dr. Hartley inclined his head slightly, but there was no grief in his expression, no softening of those dark eyes. "My uncle had been in poor health for some time," he said. "His heart was failing. It was only a matter of time." There was something in the way he said it, a flatness, a detachment, that made me uneasy. I thought of Sir William's words, the warning he had tried to give. I thought of the ghost on my landing, the desperate plea for help, and I thought of the instruments scattered across the desk, the vials and the wires and the diagrams, and I wondered what kind of physician kept such things in a library. "He seemed in some distress when I found him," I said, carefully. "He spoke of—" He paused before he could finish his thought. He seemed troubled. Dr. Hartley's eyes sharpened, and I saw a flicker of something in his expression. Curiosity, perhaps, or suspicion. "What did he say to you, Mrs. Ashford?" I hesitated. I could not tell him the truth. Not all of it. Not the warning about experiments and murder. But I could tell him enough to gauge his reaction. "He asked me to promise him something," I said. "He said that if something should happen to him, I should not believe everything I was told. He seemed to think there were those who would prefer certain truths remain hidden." The silence that followed was heavy and charged, and I saw Dr. Hartley's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "My uncle was prone to fanciful notions in his final months," he said at last, and his voice was colder now, more guarded. "The laudanum he took for his pain often left him confused and agitated. I would not place too much weight on his words, Mrs. Ashford. They meant nothing, but they did mean something." I could see it in the way his hands, which had been resting casually on the edge of the desk, now gripped the wood with a tension that belied his calm tone. I could see it in the way his eyes would not quite meet mine, sliding instead to the fire, to the books, to anywhere but my face. "Of course," I said softly. "Forgive me. I did not mean to intrude on your grief." "You are not intruding," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It was kind of you to see my uncle home. I am grateful for your compassion." He moved toward the door, a clear dismissal, and I knew I had only moments left. I made a decision, reckless and impulsive, driven by the memory of a ghost's desperate voice. "Dr. Hartley," I said quickly, before I could lose my nerve, "I could not help but notice your library. It is quite extensive." He paused, his hand on the door frame, and turned back to me. "It was my uncle's pride," he said. "He was a great collector of medical and scientific texts." "I am a copier of manuscripts," I said, the lie coming easily, smoothly, because it was not entirely a lie. "I do earn my living that way, and I had copied medical treatises before. I work for several scholars and physicians, cataloging and transcribing their collections. If you should require assistance in organizing Sir William's library or in preparing an inventory for his estate, I would be honored to offer my services." I saw the surprise in his eyes, quickly masked. It was an audacious offer, inappropriate even, for a woman to make to a man she had just met, in a house of mourning no less. But I also saw something else. Interest. Calculation. He looked at me for a long moment, and I forced myself to hold his gaze, to keep my expression calm and professional, even though my heart was pounding. "That is a generous offer," he said slowly. "I had not yet considered what to do with my uncle's books. There are thousands of volumes, many quite rare. It would indeed require someone with experience. I have references, I said. I can provide them at your convenience. He seemed to be weighing something, his dark eyes never leaving my face, and I had the unsettling sense that he could see through me, that he knew I had some ulterior motive, even if he could not guess what it was. Finally, he nodded. Very well, Mrs. Ashford. I shall consider your offer. Leave your direction with my butler, and I shall send word within the week. Thank you, I said, allowing myself a small, grateful smile. You are very kind. He did not return the smile. Kindness has nothing to do with it, he said quietly. I simply recognize competence when I see it. And I suspect, Mrs. Ashford, that you are far more competent than you appear. Before I could respond, before I could decide whether his words were a compliment or a warning, he opened the door and gestured for me to precede him into the hallway. The butler was waiting, impassive as ever, and Dr. Hartley gave him a brief nod. Mrs. Ashford will leave her address, he said. See that she is shown out. And then he was gone, disappearing back into the library and closing the door behind him with a soft, final click. I left my address, scribbled on a card the butler provided, and I walked out into the cold November morning feeling as though I had just stepped into something far deeper and more dangerous than I had anticipated. James Hartley was not a man who could be easily read or easily managed. He was intelligent, guarded, and there was something about him, something in the shadows beneath his eyes and the tension in his hands that spoke of secrets kept and lines crossed. And yet I could not deny the pull I had felt when he looked at me, the way my pulse had quickened under his gaze, the way I had wanted him to see me not as a shabby widow in need of work, but as someone worthy of his attention, his respect, perhaps even his trust. I walked home slowly, my mind full of questions. If Dr. Hartley had indeed been involved in his uncle's death, what had his motive been? What experiments had Sir William spoken of? And why had the ghost chosen me, of all people, to seek justice? I arrived at my apartment in the early afternoon, exhausted and unsettled, and I had barely removed my cloak when I felt the change in the air. The temperature dropped suddenly, as though all the warmth had been sucked from the room, and I turned to find Sir William Hartley standing beside my small writing desk, his translucent form more solid than it had been that morning. His eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me shiver. You went to my house, he said, and there was relief in his voice, and something like gratitude. You have met him. You have met James. I have, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. I had no idea how to speak to a ghost, what tone to use, what words would not sound absurd. Sir William, I must know. What happened to you? What did Dr. Hartley do? The ghost moved closer, and I fought the instinct to step back. He is not what you think, Sir William said, and there was anguish in his voice, a deep, wrenching pain that seemed to fill the small room. He is brilliant, Eleanor. Brilliant and ambitious and desperate to prove that the soul can survive the death of the body, that consciousness can be preserved, captured, studied. I agreed to help him. I was dying, you see, and I thought, what harm could it do? What harm to let him try his experiments, to let him map the pathways of my dying mind? I stared at him, horror and pity warring in my chest. And what went wrong? He closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked almost human, almost solid. I do not know, he said. I remember the wires, the electrodes attached to my temples, the bitter taste of the chemicals he gave me to heighten my awareness. I remember lying in the laboratory, in the room behind the library, and I remember feeling my heart begin to fail. And then there was pain, Eleanor, such pain as I have never known. And James standing over me, watching, taking notes, not helping, not calling for aid. And then, nothing. Darkness. And when I woke, I was no longer in my body. I was no longer alive. Did he kill you? I asked, my voice trembling. Was it murder, or was it simply an experiment that went too far? The ghost opened his eyes, and they were filled with such confusion, such torment, that I felt tears prick at my own eyes. I do not know, he said again. That is why I need you, Eleanor. I need you to find out. I need you to discover whether James is a murderer or simply a man who loved science more than he loved me. I need you to give me the truth. so that I may rest." I nodded, though I did not know how I would do what he asked. I did not know how to investigate a death when the only witness was a ghost, when the only suspect was a man whose dark eyes and brilliant mind had already begun to unsettle me in ways I did not wish to examine. "I will try," I said. "I have offered to catalog the library. If Dr. Hartley accepts, I will have access to the house, to the room where you died. I will look for evidence, for something that will tell me what truly happened." The ghost looked at me with such gratitude, such desperate hope, that I felt the weight of his expectations settle on my shoulders like a mantle. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you, Eleanor. You are the only one who can help me, the only one who can see me, hear me. I do not know why you were chosen, but I am grateful for it." He began to fade then, his form growing dimmer, more transparent, until I could see the wall through his chest, the desk through his hands. "Do not trust him completely," he said, his voice growing fainter. "James is not cruel, but he is obsessed. And obsession, Eleanor, can make monsters of even the kindest men." And then he was gone, and I was alone in my cold room, staring at the empty space where he had stood, my mind reeling with everything I had learned and everything I still needed to discover. I sat down at my desk, my hands shaking, and I tried to think clearly, rationally, the way Thomas had taught me to think when faced with a problem. I wrote down everything I knew, everything Sir William had told me, everything I had observed in Dr. Hartley's library. The instruments, the diagrams, the vials of chemicals, the experiments on consciousness and the soul, the pain, the darkness, the watching without helping. It could have been murder, or it could have been a terrible mistake, a scientific inquiry that had gone horribly, fatally wrong. But either way, Sir William was dead, and his ghost could not rest, and I was the only one who could help him. I thought of Dr. Hartley, of his dark eyes and his guarded expression, of the way he had looked at me as though trying to solve a puzzle. I thought of the pull I had felt in his presence, the dangerous attraction to a man who might be a killer, who was certainly hiding something. I told myself it was foolish to feel anything for him. I told myself that I was doing this for Sir William, for justice, for the truth. I told myself that whatever I felt when Dr. Hartley looked at me was simply nerves or fear, or the natural response to a handsome, intelligent man in a house full of secrets. But as I sat there in the fading afternoon light, I knew that I was lying to myself. I knew that I was walking into something far more complicated than a simple investigation, something that would test not only my courage, but my heart. And I knew, with a cold certainty that made me shiver, that before this was over, I would have to choose between the dead and the living, between the ghost who begged for justice and the man who might have killed him. I only hoped I would have the strength to make the right choice. The letter arrived on Tuesday, 3 days after my visit to Berkeley Square. It was delivered by a boy in livery, who handed it to me with the kind of casual indifference that suggested he delivered such letters to shabby boarding houses in Bloomsbury every day. I took it with trembling hands, broke the plain wax seal, and read the precise, angular script that could only belong to one man. "Mrs. Ashford, I have considered your offer and find it acceptable. You may begin work on my uncle's library tomorrow at 9 o'clock. I trust you will conduct yourself with discretion and efficiency. The household is still in mourning. Dr. J. Hartley." There was no warmth in it, no courtesy beyond the bare minimum required by propriety. And yet, I read it 3 times, studying the way he formed his letters, the pressure of his pen on the paper, as though I could divine something of his character from the ink and the words. I told myself I was looking for clues, for evidence of guilt or innocence. I did not let myself acknowledge that I was simply trying to understand him, this man who had already begun to occupy too much space in my thoughts. That night, Sir William came to me again. I had grown almost accustomed to his visits, to the sudden drop in temperature that announced his presence, to the way he materialized in the corner of my room like fog condensing into human form. He stood by the window, looking out at the dark street below, his translucent hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that must have been habitual in life. "You are going to the house tomorrow," he said without turning. "You will be careful, Eleanor. You will not let James know what you are searching for. I will be careful, I promised, though I was not at all certain I could keep such a promise. Dr. Hartley did not strike me as a man easily deceived, but I will look for your laboratory. I will try to understand what happened. The ghost turned to face me, and his expression was sad and weary. The laboratory is behind the library, he said. There is a door, disguised as a bookcase, in the east wall. James keeps it locked, but the key is in the desk drawer, the second from the left, beneath a stack of correspondence. He does not know that I know this. He thought me too ill to pay attention in those final weeks. But I watched him, Eleanor. I watched him prepare for the experiment that would end my life. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with his ghostly presence. Why did you agree to it? I asked softly. Why did you let him experiment on you if you had doubts? Because I was dying, he said simply. Because I thought, what did it matter? If James could learn something, if he could advance the cause of science, if he could prove that consciousness survives death, then perhaps my suffering would have meaning. And because I loved him, Eleanor, he is my brother's son, raised in my house after his parents died. I loved him as I would have loved my own child if I had ever had one. I wanted to give him this gift. His voice broke on the last word, and I saw the shimmer of what might have been tears in his translucent eyes. Even the dead, it seemed, could weep. I am sorry, I whispered. I am so sorry, Sir William. Just find the truth, he said. That is all I ask. Find the truth and let me go. He faded then, and I was left alone with my thoughts and my fears and the letter that lay on my desk, summoning me to the house where a man had died and where his killer, or his grieving nephew, waited. I slept poorly that night, and I rose before dawn to prepare myself. I dressed in my most severe gown, a black bombazine that I had worn in the first months of my own widowhood, and I pinned my hair tightly, severely, in a style that made me look older and more formidable than I felt. I wanted to appear professional, competent, unremarkable. I wanted to be the kind of woman a man like Dr. Hartley would overlook, would underestimate, would not think to watch too closely. I arrived at Berkeley Square precisely at 9 o'clock, and the butler admitted me with the same impassive courtesy he had shown before. Dr. Hartley is in his study, madam, he said. He asked that you begin in the library without disturbing him. If you require anything, you may ring. Thank you, I said, and I followed him down the familiar hallway to the library, my heart beating faster with each step. The room was exactly as I remembered it. The tall windows, the crowded shelves, the desk covered in papers and instruments, but the fire was unlit, and the morning light was gray and cold, and the air smelled faintly of chemicals and old leather and something else I could not quite identify. Decay, perhaps, or simply the scent of a house where death had recently visited. The butler left me, and I stood for a moment in the center of the room, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness, letting myself feel the weight of what I was about to do. I was about to search the private papers of a man I barely knew, to look for evidence that might condemn him. It was a violation, a betrayal of trust, and yet I could not turn back now. Sir William's ghost waited, and I had made a promise. I began with the desk. I moved quietly, carefully, listening for footsteps in the hallway, for the creak of floorboards that might signal Dr. Hartley's approach. I opened the drawers one by one, cataloging their contents in my mind. Medical journals, correspondence from colleagues at various hospitals and universities, bills from chemists and instrument makers. Nothing unusual, nothing incriminating, until I reached the second drawer on the left. There, beneath a stack of letters tied with black ribbon, I found a leather-bound notebook. I lifted it carefully, my hands trembling slightly, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was Dr. Hartley's, that same angular, precise script, but the words were not what I had expected. Observations on the preservation of consciousness, I read. A series of experiments conducted with the consent and participation of Sir William Hartley, October through November 1887. I turned the page and I began to read. What I found there was not the confession of a murderer, but the journal of a scientist, meticulous and detailed and utterly without emotion. Dr. Hartley had documented everything. The doses of laudanum and other chemicals he had administered to Sir William, the electrical stimulation applied to specific points on the skull, the measurements taken of pulse and respiration and pupil dilation. The verbal responses Sir William had given, describing what he felt, what he saw, whether he could sense any separation of mind from body. It was fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. I could see the brilliance of Dr. Hartley's mind in the careful methodology, the way he controlled for variables, the precision of his notes. But I could also see the coldness, the way he referred to his uncle as Subject A, the way he recorded Sir William's pain with the same detachment he might record the temperature of a solution or the weight of a specimen. I read entry after entry, and I felt my understanding of what had happened begin to shift. This was not murder, not in the way I had imagined. This was something more complex, more ambiguous. This was a man who had been willing to sacrifice his own uncle in the pursuit of knowledge, who had watched him suffer and had not stopped, because stopping would have meant losing the data, losing the chance to prove his theories. And then I reached the final entry, dated the night of Sir William's death. Subject A's condition has deteriorated rapidly. Heart rate erratic, respiration shallow. He is in significant pain despite increased dosage of morphine. I have administered the final preparation. The compound, I believe, will heighten awareness at the moment of transition. If my calculations are correct, his consciousness should remain active for several minutes after cardiac arrest, allowing me to observe and record the process of death itself. This is the culmination of months of work. I cannot fail now. And then, below, in a hand that was less steady, less controlled, Subject A expired at 11:47 p.m. I observed cessation of heart function at 11:43. For 4 minutes, he remained conscious, his eyes open, his pupils responsive to light. He tried to speak, but could not. I attempted to record his neural activity using the electroencephalograph, but the readings were inconclusive. At 11:47, all signs of life ceased. The experiment was a failure. I could not capture what I sought. His consciousness, his soul, if such a thing exists, eluded me. He is dead, and I have learned nothing. I closed the notebook, my hands shaking, my mind reeling. This was the truth Sir William had sent me to find. Not murder, not in the legal sense, but something perhaps worse. A betrayal of love and trust, a prioritization of ambition over compassion, a willingness to let a man suffer and die for the sake of science. I sat there, the notebook in my lap, and I did not know what to feel. Horror, certainly. Pity for Sir William, who had given his consent but could not have truly understood what he was consenting to. But also a strange, reluctant understanding of Dr. Hartley, whose entire journal had been suffused with a desperate, aching need to prove that death was not the end, that consciousness could be preserved, that the people we loved did not simply vanish into nothingness. It was the grief of a man who had lost too much and who had turned to science as a way to fight back against the finality of death. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and I quickly returned the notebook to the drawer, arranging the letters over it exactly as I had found them. I moved to the shelves and pulled down a random volume, opening it and pretending to study the title page, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain it could be heard throughout the house. The door opened, and Dr. Hartley entered. He was dressed more formally than he had been at our first meeting, in a black frock coat and a crisply starched collar, his hair combed back from his forehead. But his eyes were still shadowed, and there was a tightness around his mouth that spoke of sleepless nights and burdens carried alone. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, inclining his head slightly, "I trust you have everything you require." "I do, thank you," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Your uncle's collection is remarkable. It will take several weeks to catalog properly." He moved to the desk, and I felt my pulse quicken. Would he notice that I had disturbed the papers? That the drawer was not quite closed as tightly as it should have been? But he simply glanced at the surface, his hand reaching out to straighten a stack of journals, and then he turned his attention to me. "My uncle was a collector of curiosities," he said, and there was something in his voice, a faint warmth, that had not been there before. He believed that knowledge was the highest pursuit, that understanding the mechanisms of life and death was a sacred duty. I share his beliefs. "It is a noble pursuit," I said carefully, "though some might argue that there are limits to what we should seek to understand." His eyes sharpened, and I saw the intelligence in them, the quick, probing assessment. "Do you believe in limits, Mrs.?" Ashford, do you believe there are questions we should not ask, truths we should not seek? I believe, I said slowly, that the pursuit of knowledge should not come at the cost of compassion. That understanding is meaningless if it requires us to inflict suffering on those we claim to care for. He was silent for a long moment, and I could not read his expression. Then he smiled, but it was a sad, bitter smile that did not reach his eyes. You speak like a moralist, he said, or perhaps like someone who has known suffering herself. I am a widow, I said quietly. I know what it is to lose someone, to want answers that do not exist. I know what it is to rage against the silence of death. His face softened, just slightly, and for a moment I saw beneath the cold exterior to the man underneath, the man who was grieving and guilty and desperate for absolution he did not believe he deserved. I am sorry for your loss, he said, and his voice was genuine. How long has it been? 3 years, I said. He fell. It was an accident, or so I was told. Dr. Hartley's eyes widened very slightly, and I saw understanding dawn in them. You do not believe it was an accident, he said. You think there was more to it. That is why you go to seances, why you seek the dead. You are looking for answers, just as I am. I felt exposed, seen in a way that was both uncomfortable and strangely exhilarating. Yes, I admitted. I go because I cannot accept that he is simply gone, that I will never know the truth. And because I am afraid that if I stop searching, I will have to accept that he is truly lost to me. We are not so different, you and I, he said softly. We are both haunted by the dead. We both seek something that may not exist. I wanted to tell him then. I wanted to say that the dead could speak, that I had seen his uncle's ghost, that I knew what he had done and why. But I could not. Not yet. Not until I understood what justice would mean, what truth Sir William truly deserved. Instead, I simply nodded, and I held his gaze, and I felt the pull between us intensify, that dangerous attraction that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with the recognition of a kindred spirit, another soul damaged by loss and driven by the need to understand. May I ask, I said, breaking the silence before it could become too heavy, what you plan to do with Sir William's research, his notes and papers? Will you continue his work? Dr. Hartley turned away, moving to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that reminded me painfully of his uncle's ghost. I do not know, he said. My uncle and I were collaborating on a project, a study of consciousness at the moment of death. He believed that the soul could be measured, proven, preserved. I was more skeptical, but I agreed to help him. The work was unfinished when he died. Will you finish it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was rough, strained. I do not know if I have the right to continue, he said, or the courage. The experiment failed, Mrs. Ashford. My uncle died, and I learned nothing. All that suffering, all that pain, and I could not save him, could not capture what I sought. I do not know if I can face that failure again. I moved closer to him, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice, by the grief he was finally allowing to show. Dr. Hartley, I said gently, James, you cannot blame yourself for his death. He was dying already. You said so yourself. He turned to face me, and his eyes were dark with anguish. But I could have made his final days easier, he said. I could have given him morphine, kept him comfortable, let him die in peace. Instead, I subjected him to experiment after experiment, because I was desperate to prove that I was right, that death could be conquered. I put my ambition above his suffering. That is unforgivable. I reached out without thinking and placed my hand on his arm. The touch was electric, inappropriate, and yet I could not pull away. It is not unforgivable, I said. It is human. You wanted to save him, to find a way to keep him with you. That is not ambition. That is love. He looked down at my hand on his arm, and I saw something shift in his expression. His own hand came up to cover mine, his fingers warm and strong against my skin. You are very kind, Mrs. Ashford, he said softly, kinder than I deserve. But you do not know what I have done. You do not know what I am capable of. Then tell me, I said, my voice trembling. Tell me the truth, and let me decide for myself, For a moment, I thought he would. I thought he would confess everything, would lay bare the experiments and the pain and the terrible, desperate hope that had driven him to watch his uncle die. But then he stepped back, withdrawing his hand, and the shutters came down over his eyes once more. "I cannot," he said. "Not now. Perhaps not ever. You should continue your work, Mrs. Ashford, and I should not keep you from it." He left then, closing the door softly behind him, and I stood alone in the library, my hand still tingling from his touch, my mind spinning with everything he had almost said. I returned to the shelves, but I could not focus on the books. I kept thinking of his words, of the anguish in his voice, of the way he had looked at me as though I might somehow offer him redemption. And I thought of Sir William's ghost, waiting for justice, and I wondered how I could possibly give him what he needed without destroying the man I was beginning to care for far too much. I worked through the morning, making notes on the volumes I catalogued, but my mind was always half elsewhere, listening for Dr. Hartley's footsteps, wondering what he was doing in his study, whether he was thinking of me as I was thinking of him. At noon, the butler brought me tea and sandwiches on a tray, and I ate mechanically, barely tasting the food. It was mid-afternoon, the light beginning to fade, when I decided I could wait no longer. Dr. Hartley had left the house. I had heard the front door close an hour earlier, and the servants seemed to be occupied in other parts of the building. I moved to the east wall, running my hands along the shelves, pressing gently on the spines of books, looking for the hidden door Sir William had described. I found it behind a collection of anatomical texts, a section of shelving that looked no different from the rest, but that moved slightly when I applied pressure to the right spot. I felt along the edge, found the catch, and heard the soft click of a lock releasing. The bookcase swung open, revealing a narrow doorway and a set of stone steps leading down into darkness. I hesitated, my heart pounding, every instinct telling me not to go down there, not to see what waited in the darkness. But I had come too far to turn back now. I took the candle from the desk, lit it with a match from the box beside the inkwell, and descended the steps. The laboratory was small, no larger than a pantry, with stone walls and a low ceiling. It smelled of chemicals, and damp, and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made my stomach turn. There was a narrow table in the center, covered with a stained sheet, and I did not need to look beneath it to know that this was where Sir William had died. The walls were lined with shelves, holding jars and bottles and instruments I could not identify. Wires and electrodes hung from hooks, and in the corner stood a machine with dials and meters and a crank handle, humming faintly with residual electrical charge. I moved closer to the table, my hands shaking, my candle casting wild shadows on the walls. And then I saw it, a notebook, smaller than the one I had found in the desk, lying open on a shelf beside the table. I picked it up, and I read the final entry, written in Dr. Hartley's hand, but different somehow, more desperate, more raw. I watched him die. I watched my uncle, the man who raised me, the man I loved more than anyone in this world, and I did nothing to ease his suffering because I was a coward and a fool. I thought I could control death, could understand it, could perhaps even defeat it. But I was wrong. Death is not a puzzle to be solved or a mechanism to be understood. It is a mystery, and it is final, and I have learned that there are some things we are not meant to know. I have killed him as surely as if I had placed my hands around his throat, and I do not know how to live with what I have done. I closed the notebook, tears streaming down my face, and I understood then that Dr. Hartley was not a monster. He was simply a man who had made a terrible mistake, who had let his grief and his fear and his desperate need for answers lead him to do something unforgivable. And now he was living with the consequences, carrying the weight of his uncle's death, unable to forgive himself, unable to move forward. I heard a sound behind me, a sharp intake of breath, and I spun around to find Dr. Hartley standing in the doorway, his face pale and stricken, his eyes fixed on me with a mixture of horror and betrayal. "You found it?" he said, his voice hollow. "You found the laboratory." I had no words. I could only nod, the notebook still clutched in my hands, the evidence of his guilt and his grief. He descended the steps slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. "I suppose you know everything now?" he said. "I suppose you understand what I am." "I understand that you loved him," I said, my voice breaking. "I understand that you were trying to help, and that you made a terrible mistake. I understand that you are suffering, James, and that you do not know how to forgive yourself." He laughed, but it was a bitter, broken sound. "Forgive myself?" he said. "How can I forgive myself for what I have done? I let him die in agony because I was too arrogant to accept that some questions have no answers. I am a murderer, Mrs. Ashford, whether the law would call me so or not." "You are not a murderer," I said fiercely. "You are a man who made a choice, and that choice had consequences you did not foresee." But Sir William consented. He wanted to help you. He believed in what you were trying to do. Dr. Hartley shook his head, his hands clenching at his sides. "It does not matter what he believed," he said. "I should have been strong enough to refuse. I should have chosen compassion over curiosity. And now he is dead, and I am left with nothing but guilt and the knowledge that I failed him in every way that matters." We stood there in the cold, dark laboratory, surrounded by the instruments of death and the evidence of failure, and I saw in his eyes the same desperate need for absolution that I had seen in Sir William's ghost. Two men, uncle and nephew, both haunted, both trapped by the choices they had made and the love they had lost. And I knew in that moment that I could not condemn him. I could not give Sir William the justice he sought, because to do so would be to destroy the man I was falling in love with, the man whose pain I understood too well because it mirrored my own. I made my choice then, though I did not yet know what it would cost me. I stepped forward, and I took Dr. Hartley's hand in mine, and I said the only words I could. "I forgive you, James. Even if you cannot forgive yourself, I forgive you, and I will help you, if you will let me. I will help you find a way to live with what you have done, to honor Sir William's memory, not by punishing yourself, but by using what you have learned to help others, to ease suffering rather than cause it." He looked at me as though I had offered him salvation, his dark eyes searching my face, and then, slowly, he nodded. "I do not deserve your kindness," he said, "but I will try to earn it." And in that moment, standing in the cold laboratory where Sir William had died, I sealed my fate and Sir William's both, choosing love over justice, the living over the dead, and praying that I would not come to regret it. I did not tell Sir William what I had found. When his ghost appeared to me that evening, materializing in my cold room with his pale, expectant eyes fixed on my face, I lied to him for the first time. I told him I had gained access to the house, that I was making progress, that I needed more time to search for evidence. I did not tell him about the laboratory, about the notebooks, about the terrible choice his nephew had made between love and science. I did not tell him that I had forgiven the man who had watched him die. I told myself it was not truly a lie. I told myself I needed to understand more, to be certain of what had happened before I delivered my verdict. But in truth, I was simply buying time, delaying the moment when I would have to look into Sir William's desperate, trusting eyes and tell him that I had chosen his killer over his ghost. The days that followed were among the strangest of my life. I went to Berkeley Square each morning, arriving precisely at 9, and I worked in the library cataloging volumes and making notes while Dr. Hartley moved through the house like a restless spirit himself. Sometimes he would join me, sitting at the desk while I worked at the shelves, and we would talk, not about his uncle, not about the experiments or the laboratory or the guilt that hung between us like fog, but about other things, about literature and philosophy, about the nature of consciousness and the mystery of memory, about whether the soul was a thing that could be measured or simply a word we used to describe the ineffable spark that made us human. He was brilliant, more brilliant than any man I had ever met, and his mind moved with a speed and precision that left me breathless. But more than his intelligence, I was drawn to his vulnerability, to the moments when his careful control would slip and I would see the grief beneath, raw and unhealed. He spoke of his childhood, of losing his parents to cholera when he was 12, of Sir William taking him in and raising him as a son. He spoke of medical school, of the first time he had seen a patient die and realized that all his knowledge, all his training, could not stop the inevitable march toward oblivion. He spoke of the loneliness that came with being too clever, too intense, too unwilling to accept easy answers or comfortable lies. And I spoke too, more than I had spoken to anyone in the 3 years since Thomas died. I told him about my marriage, about the quiet, steady love I had felt for a man who had been kind and decent and utterly without ambition. I told him about the day I learned Thomas had fallen, about the way the world had narrowed to a single point of pain, about the years of searching for answers that would never come. I told him about the seances, about Mrs. Calloway and her cold fingers and her vague pronouncements, about the desperate hope that had turned slowly into resignation. I did not tell him that I could see the dead, that his uncle's ghost came to me each night. That secret I kept locked away, too dangerous to share, too strange to explain. We grew closer, James and I, in the way that two wounded souls will sometimes find each other in the darkness. It was not the slow, comfortable courtship of my marriage to Thomas, with its predictable progression from friendship to affection to love. This was something fiercer, more immediate, born of shared pain and mutual recognition. When he looked at me, I felt seen in a way I had not felt since Thomas died. When I spoke, he listened with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. And when our hands would brush accidentally as we reached for the same book, or when he would stand close behind me to point out a passage he wanted me to read, I would feel a heat that had nothing to do with the fire in the grate, and everything to do with the dangerous attraction that was building between us. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was betraying Sir William, betraying the promise I had made to seek justice, betraying my own principles by allowing myself to care for a man who had committed what amounted to murder, whatever name he gave it. But I could not seem to stop myself. James had become necessary to me, his presence in my days as vital as breath, and I found myself thinking of him constantly, counting the hours until I could return to Berkeley Square, to the library where we talked, and the moments when he would let his guard down, and I would see the man beneath the guilt and the grief. It was on the 8th day of my employment that everything began to unravel. I had been working in the library all morning, and James had been with me, reading through his uncle's correspondence and sorting papers for the estate. We had fallen into a comfortable silence, broken only by the scratch of his pen and the rustle of pages, and I had allowed myself to feel something like contentment, something like peace. And then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear in the stillness. "Eleanor," he said, and my name on his lips sent a shiver through me. "I want to show you something I have not shown anyone else." I looked up from the volume I had been cataloging, and I saw the hesitation in his face, the vulnerability. "What is it?" I asked. He stood and moved to the hidden door behind the bookcases, the door I had discovered days before. "Come with me," he said. "Please. I need you to understand." I followed him down the stone steps into the laboratory, my heart beginning to beat faster. The room looked different in the daylight that filtered weakly through a small, high window I had not noticed before. Less sinister, perhaps, but no less sad. The stained table, the instruments, the machine with its dials and wires, all waiting silently like actors on a stage after the curtain has fallen. James moved to the far wall and pulled aside a canvas sheet I had not seen in the candlelight. Beneath it stood another machine, larger and more complex than anything else in the room. It was made of brass and copper and glass, with coils and condensers and what looked like a series of photographic plates arranged in a circle. Wires ran from it to a chair that sat in the center, a chair with metal bands at the arms and headrest, and I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. "What is it?" I whispered. James ran his hand along the brass housing, and there was something almost tender in the gesture. "It is my life's work," he said, "or it was meant to be. The consciousness capture apparatus. I designed it to record the electrical patterns of the brain at the moment of death, to preserve the unique signature of an individual's thoughts and memories and personality. My uncle believed that if we could capture consciousness, we could prove the existence of the soul. And I thought, perhaps foolishly, that if we could capture it, we might also be able to preserve it, to hold onto the people we love, even after their bodies fail." He turned to face me, and his eyes were dark with emotion. "That was the experiment, Eleanor. That was what we were trying to do. I did not kill my uncle deliberately. I was trying to save him in the only way I knew how. But the machine failed. The readings were inconclusive. And all I succeeded in doing was prolonging his suffering and watching him die. I stepped closer to him, my hands reaching out instinctively to touch his arm, to offer comfort. "You cannot blame yourself," I said, though my voice was not as steady as I would have liked. "You were trying to help. You were trying to conquer death itself. That is not evil, James. That is human. But it was arrogant," he said bitterly. "And it was cruel. I should have known better. I should have accepted that some things are beyond our control, that death is the one certainty we cannot escape or improve upon. Instead, I played God, and my uncle paid the price." We stood there in the dim laboratory, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that if I leaned forward just slightly, I could rest my head against his chest, and I wanted to. I wanted to offer him the comfort of touch, the reassurance that he was not alone in his guilt and his grief. But I held back, because I knew that if I allowed myself that closeness, I would be lost entirely. "James," I said softly, "what will you do now? Will you continue the work?" He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "I do not know. Part of me wants to destroy all of this, to burn the notebooks and dismantle the machine and forget I ever tried to play with forces I do not understand. But another part of me cannot let it go, cannot accept that my uncle's death was meaningless, that all his suffering accomplished nothing. If I could just refine the apparatus, if I could just make one more attempt, perhaps I could prove that his sacrifice was not in vain." I felt a chill run through me, and it had nothing to do with the cold stone walls. "You are thinking of trying again," I said, "of finding another subject." He met my eyes, and I saw the desperation there, the obsession that Sir William's ghost had warned me about. "Not a subject," he said. "Myself. When my time comes, whenever that may be, I will use the machine on myself. I will be both the scientist and the experiment. Perhaps then I will find the answers I seek, or perhaps I will simply die, as my uncle did, and learn nothing." "No," I said, and the word came out more forcefully than I intended. "You cannot do that, James. You cannot throw your life away on a quest that may have no answer. Your uncle would not want that. I do not want that." He reached up and touched my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek, and I felt tears begin to slip down my face, though I had not realized I was crying. "You are too kind, Eleanor," he said. "Too good. I do not deserve your concern, your friendship, your—" He paused, searching for the right word, and I held my breath, waiting. "Your regard," he finished quietly, "but I am grateful for it nonetheless." I wanted to tell him then. I wanted to say that my regard was far more than friendship, that I was falling in love with him despite every reason I had to resist, that the thought of him dying alone in this laboratory broke my heart in ways I could not articulate, but the words would not come. Instead, I simply stood there, his hand on my face, my tears falling, and I let him see the truth in my eyes even if I could not speak it aloud. He leaned closer, and for one breathless moment I thought he might kiss me. I wanted him to, wanted it with an intensity that frightened me. But then he stepped back, withdrawing his hand, and the moment was broken. "Forgive me," he said, his voice strained. "That was inappropriate. You are employed in my household, and I have taken advantage of your kindness. It will not happen again." "James," I began, but he shook his head. "Please," he said, "say nothing. Let us return to the library and pretend this conversation never occurred." He walked to the stairs, and I followed, my heart aching with everything unsaid, everything unfinished. We returned to the library in silence, and he excused himself shortly after, claiming he had letters to write. I worked alone for the rest of the afternoon, my mind spinning, my hands moving mechanically through the task of cataloging while my thoughts were elsewhere. That night, Sir William came to me with a fury I had not seen before. He appeared not by the window or the door, but directly in front of me, his translucent form crackling with a kind of supernatural rage that made the temperature plummet and the candle on my desk gutter and nearly go out. "You have found nothing," he said, and his voice was cold and accusatory. "You have been in my house for more than a week, and you have found nothing. Or you have found something and you are not telling me. Which is it, Eleanor?" I stood, my hands trembling, and I tried to meet his eyes but could not. "Sir William, I have been searching. I have been trying to understand what happened to you. But it is complicated, and I need more time." "Time," he repeated, and there was a bitter laugh in his voice. "I have no time, Eleanor. I am dead, trapped in this liminal state, unable to move forward or back, and you are my only hope. You promised you would help me. You promised you would find the truth and deliver justice. Or was that promise as empty as all the others made to the dead?" "It was not empty," I said, and my voice broke. "I am trying, Sir William. I am trying to do what you asked. But what if the truth is not what you think? What if there is no villain, no murderer, only a man who made a terrible mistake out of love and desperation?" The ghost's form flickered, and I saw something like understanding dawn in his pale eyes. "You have feelings for him," he said slowly. "For James. You have fallen in love with the man who killed me." I could not deny it. I could not speak the words, but my silence was answer enough. Sir William's expression twisted with betrayal and rage. "You were supposed to help me," he said, his voice rising to a terrible pitch that made my windows rattle and my furniture shake. "You were supposed to seek justice, not romance. I trusted you, Eleanor, and you have betrayed me as surely as James betrayed me. You are no better than he is. Please," I said, reaching out as though I could touch him, as though I could somehow make him understand. "Please, Sir William, I have not betrayed you. I am simply trying to understand what justice means, what you truly need. Would condemning James bring you peace? Would seeing him hanged or imprisoned ease your suffering, or would it simply add more pain to a world already full of it?" "What I need," he said, and his voice was low and venomous, "is for the truth to be told. I need for the world to know what he did, what he is capable of. I need for him to face the consequences of his actions. And if you will not help me achieve that, then I will find another way." He vanished then, not fading but disappearing like a snuffed flame, and I was left alone in my room, shaking with cold and fear and a terrible sense of foreboding. I did not know what he meant by finding another way, but I knew it could not be anything good. A ghost scorned, a spirit denied justice, could do more harm than any living man, or so the stories said, and I had just made an enemy of the one person who had trusted me, who had chosen me as his champion. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the darkness, wrapped in my shawl, and I tried to think clearly, rationally, about what I should do. I could tell James the truth, confess that I had been seeing his uncle's ghost, that Sir William knew what had happened and wanted justice. But how could I explain it without sounding mad? How could I make him believe me when I barely believed it myself? Or I could tell Sir William everything, confess my feelings for James, and beg him to understand that love and justice were not always compatible, that sometimes mercy was the higher virtue. But I had already tried that, and it had only made things worse, or I could simply leave. I could resign my position, stop going to Berkeley Square, remove myself from the entire terrible situation, and let the dead and the living sort out their own conflicts without me. But even as I thought it, I knew I could not do it. I could not abandon James, could not leave him to face his uncle's wrath alone, and I could not abandon Sir William, could not leave him trapped and suffering simply because his quest for justice was inconvenient to my heart. I was caught between them, between the ghost and the man, between duty and desire, and I did not know how to free myself. The next day, I went to Berkeley Square as usual, though I felt hollowed out by lack of sleep and worry. James was in the library when I arrived, standing by the window and staring out at the gray street beyond. He turned when he heard me enter, and I saw that he looked as haggard as I felt, with dark circles beneath his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that spoke of a night as sleepless as my own. "Eleanor," he said, and my name was both a greeting and a question. "I must apologize for yesterday. I should not have burdened you with my troubles. You have your own grief to bear. It was selfish of me." "It was not selfish," I said, setting down my bag and removing my cloak. "I wanted to understand. I wanted to know what you were trying to do, what drove you to make the choices you made." He moved closer, and I could see the struggle in his face, the war between propriety and the need for connection. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I must ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, even if the truth is difficult." "What is it?" I asked, though my heart was already beginning to pound with apprehension. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked. "Do you believe that the dead can return, that consciousness can survive the death of the body?" I stared at him, my mouth suddenly dry. "Why do you ask?" "Because," he said, and his voice was strained, almost desperate. "Because I think my uncle is haunting this house. I have heard sounds at night, footsteps in empty rooms, voices that seem to come from nowhere. I have felt cold spots that should not exist, seen shadows that have no source. And last night, I saw him, Eleanor. I saw my uncle's face reflected in the mirror of my study, pale and accusing. And when I turned around, there was no one there. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, felt the world narrow to a single point. He could see Sir William, or he thought he could. And if he could, then everything was about to come crashing down around us. "James," I said, and I had to force the words past the tightness in my throat. "What did you see?" "Exactly. What did he look like?" "He looked as he did in life," James said, "but translucent, insubstantial. And he was looking at me with such hatred, such condemnation, that I thought I might be losing my mind. I thought perhaps the guilt had finally driven me to madness, that I was seeing phantoms born of my own conscience. But it felt real, Eleanor. It felt as real as you standing before me now. I closed my eyes, trying to think, trying to decide how much I could tell him. And then I made my choice, reckless and terrifying and necessary. "James," I said, "you are not losing your mind. Your uncle is here. I have seen him too. I have been seeing him since the morning after he died, when he came to my door and told me he had been murdered and begged me to find his killer." James's face went white, and he reached out to grip the edge of the desk as though he might fall. "You have seen him," he repeated. "You have been seeing him all this time, and you said nothing." "I could not tell you," I said, my voice breaking. "How could I? You would have thought me mad, or dangerous, or both, and I did not know what it meant, whether he was truly a ghost or simply a manifestation of my own grief and guilt. But he is real, James. He is here, and he wants justice. He wants the world to know what you did." James sank into the chair behind the desk, his head in his hands. "Then it is over," he said dully. "He will not rest until I am destroyed, until I am exposed and condemned. And perhaps I deserve it. Perhaps this is the reckoning I have been waiting for." "No," I said fiercely, moving around the desk to kneel beside him. "No, James, you do not deserve to be destroyed. You made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but it was born of love and desperation, not malice, and I will not let your uncle take you from me, not when I have only just found you." He looked at me, and there were tears in his dark eyes. "You have found me," he said. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I love you," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I love you, James Hartley, despite every reason I should not, despite the ghost that haunts us both, despite the guilt and the grief and the impossibility of it all. I love you, and I will fight for you, even if it means defying the dead." He stared at me for a long moment, and then he pulled me up and into his arms, holding me with a desperate strength that took my breath away. "Eleanor," he whispered against my hair. "My God, Eleanor, I love you too. I have loved you from the moment you stood in this library and spoke of compassion and suffering, from the moment I realized you could see into my soul and did not turn away in horror. I love you, and I am terrified of what that means, of what I might lose if you ever learn the full truth of what I am." "I already know the truth," I said, pulling back to look at his face, to memorize every line and shadow. "And I choose you anyway. I choose you, James, over the dead, over duty, over everything." He kissed me then, and it was nothing like the gentle kisses Thomas had given me in our courtship. This was fierce and hungry and born of months of loneliness and grief and the terrible recognition that we had found in each other something worth fighting for. His hands tangled in my hair, and mine gripped his shoulders, and for a moment the world fell away, and there was nothing but the two of us, alive and wanting and desperately, impossibly in love. When we finally broke apart, Both of us breathless and shaking, the temperature in the room had dropped to freezing, and I knew without looking that Sir William was there, watching us, his fury a palpable force in the air. James felt it too. "He is here," he said quietly. "My uncle. He is watching us." "Yes," I said, "he is here, and he is very angry." The air crackled, and Sir William's voice filled the room, cold and terrible, and utterly without mercy. "You have betrayed me, Eleanor. You have chosen my murderer over my memory, and now you will both pay the price for your treachery." And in that moment, I realized that whatever peace I had hoped to broker between the living and the dead was impossible. Sir William would not rest, would not forgive, would not release us. And if James and I were to have any future together, we would have to find a way to free ourselves from the ghost that bound us, even if it meant doing something neither of us wanted to consider. Even if it meant finding a way to send Sir William's soul onward, whether he wished to go or not. The haunting grew worse in the days that followed. Sir William's fury manifested not just in apparitions and cold spots, but in violence that could not be ignored. Objects flew from shelves in the library, crashing to the floor with no hand to guide them. Doors slammed in empty hallways. The servants began to whisper of evil spirits and curses, and 2 of the maids gave notice, unwilling to remain in a house where the dead walked with such rage. James tried to maintain order, to offer rational explanations for the inexplicable, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. He grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, jumping at every sound, dreading the nights when his uncle's ghost would appear in his study or his bedroom, silent and accusing, a constant reminder of guilt that could not be absolved. And I was caught between them, loving James with an intensity that frightened me, mourning the ghost of a man I had barely known, but to whom I owed a debt I could not repay. I continued to go to Berkeley Square each day, though the work of cataloging had become secondary to the real task at hand, which was finding a way to give Sir William peace without destroying the man I loved. But I did not know how. I could not offer him justice, because justice in his eyes meant James's ruin. And I could not simply dismiss his claims because he had been wronged, had died in agony while his nephew watched and took notes instead of offering comfort. It was James who finally proposed the solution, though at the time I did not recognize it as such. We were sitting in the library one evening, long after the servants had retired, the fire burning low in the grate and casting dancing shadows on the walls. He had been staring at the hidden door to the laboratory for nearly an hour, his expression distant and thoughtful. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but determined. "The apparatus," he said, "the consciousness capture device. I have been thinking about it, about why it failed with my uncle, and I believe I understand now what went wrong." I looked up from the book I had been pretending to read. "What do you mean?" He turned to face me, and I saw a strange light in his dark eyes, something that might have been hope or might have been desperation. "The machine was designed to record consciousness at the moment of death," he said, "to capture the electrical patterns of the dying brain and preserve them. But death is not an instant. It is a process, a transition. And I think the machine failed because I was trying to capture something that was already leaving, already transforming into whatever comes next. But what if I had been trying to record consciousness that had already left the body? What if the machine could be used not to preserve the dying, but to communicate with the dead?" I felt my heart begin to beat faster. "You think the apparatus could let you speak to Sir William? Could let you hear him as I do?" "More than that," he said, leaning forward with an intensity that was almost frightening. "I think it could allow him to speak through the machine, to record his thoughts and memories and accusations in a form that others could hear and understand. If I could modify the apparatus, reverse its polarity, attune it to the frequency of spiritual energy rather than biological, then perhaps I could give my uncle what he wants, a voice, a way to tell his story, a means of achieving the justice he seeks." I stared at him, my mind racing. "But if he tells his story, if the world hears what happened, you will be ruined. You could be arrested, tried for murder, or at the very least for gross negligence. You could lose everything." James smiled, but it was a sad, weary smile. "I have already lost everything, Eleanor. My uncle, my peace of mind, any hope I had of redemption. The only thing I have left is you, and I cannot keep you while his ghost stands between us, demanding retribution. If giving him a voice means I must face the consequences of my actions, then so be it. Perhaps that is the only way any of us can be free. I wanted to argue, to tell him that there had to be another way, but I could not think of one, and so I nodded, and I took his hand in mine, and I said the only words I could. Then we will do it together. Whatever comes, we will face it together. The next 3 days were spent in the laboratory, working by candlelight and lamplight, modifying the brass and copper apparatus according to James's theories. I assisted where I could, fetching tools and holding wires steady while he soldered connections. But mostly, I watched him work with a kind of awed fascination. He was brilliant in those moments, his hands moving with precision and confidence, his mind solving problems faster than I could follow. And despite the gravity of what we were attempting, despite the fear that gnawed at my stomach, I felt something like joy simply being near him, being part of his world, sharing in the strange and terrible work that consumed him. Sir William's ghost appeared several times during those 3 days, watching us work with an expression I could not read. Sometimes he looked curious, almost hopeful. Other times his face was twisted with suspicion and rage, as though he believed we were attempting some new deception. But he did not speak, did not interfere, and I wondered if perhaps he sensed what we were trying to do, if some part of him understood that we were building him a bridge between the silence of death and the speaking world of the living. On the evening of the 3rd day, James stepped back from the apparatus and surveyed his work. It looked different now, more complex, with additional coils and a large horn-shaped device that resembled a phonograph speaker mounted atop the brass housing. Wires ran from the machine to a series of glass plates covered in a silver emulsion, and in the center sat the chair with its metal bands, waiting. "It is ready," James said, and his voice was hoarse with exhaustion. "Or as ready as I can make it. I do not know if it will work. I do not even know if my theories are sound. But I have done all I can." I moved to stand beside him, slipping my hand into his. "Then we will try," I said, "and whatever happens, at least we will have tried." He looked down at me, and I saw love and fear and gratitude warring in his expression. "You are the bravest woman I have ever known," he said softly, "and I do not deserve you, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your love, if you will let me." I stood on my toes and kissed him, gentle and brief, a promise and a prayer. "You already are," I whispered against his lips. "You always have been." We went upstairs then, and James sent word to his butler to admit no one the following day, that we were not to be disturbed under any circumstances. The servants, already frightened by the supernatural disturbances in the house, were only too happy to comply, and then we retired to our separate rooms, though I do not think either of us slept. I lay in the small guest chamber James had insisted I use, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me, and I prayed to a God I was not certain I believed in that what we were about to attempt would bring peace rather than more pain. Morning came gray and cold, with frost on the windows and fog rolling through the streets of Mayfair like a living thing. James and I met in the library, neither of us having eaten, neither of us able to think of anything but what lay ahead. We descended to the laboratory together, and I felt the temperature drop the moment we crossed the threshold, felt the prickling awareness that we were not alone. Sir William stood beside the apparatus, his translucent form more solid than I had ever seen it, his pale eyes fixed on the machine with an expression of mingled hope and dread. "You have built something," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the small stone room. "Something for me." James stepped forward, and I saw him gather his courage like armor. "Uncle," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling of his hands, "I have modified the consciousness apparatus. I believe it can allow you to speak, to record your testimony in a form that others can hear. If you wish to tell your story, if you wish to accuse me publicly, this machine can give you that power. All you need to do is sit in the chair and let the apparatus attune itself to your spiritual energy." The ghost looked at James for a long moment, and I could not read his expression. "And if I do this," he said slowly, "if I tell the truth of what happened, what will become of you?" James did not flinch. I will face whatever consequences the law demands, he said. If I am arrested, tried, imprisoned, or worse, I will accept it. I have no right to ask for mercy. I only ask that you allow Eleanor to go free. She had no part in what I did. She is innocent of everything except the mistake of caring for a man who does not deserve her compassion. Sir William's gaze shifted to me, and I saw the accusation in his eyes. She chose you over me, he said. She chose love over justice. How can you claim she is innocent when she has been complicit in protecting you? Because I asked her to, James said fiercely. Because I made her believe that what I did was a terrible mistake rather than a crime. Because I manipulated her emotions and her natural compassion to save myself from the reckoning I knew I deserved. If you must punish someone, Uncle, punish me. But let Eleanor go. I stepped forward then, unable to remain silent any longer. Sir William, I said, and my voice was strong despite the fear that churned in my stomach. You asked me to find the truth, and I have. Your nephew did watch you die. He did prioritize his experiment over your comfort. He did fail you in the ways that matter most, but he did not murder you. You consented to the experiment. You wanted to help him prove his theories. You gave yourself willingly to science. And the fact that the experiment caused you pain does not make it murder. It makes it a tragedy. A terrible, avoidable tragedy, but not a crime. The ghost's form flickered, and I saw something like uncertainty cross his face. I gave my consent, he said slowly, as though the words were difficult. But I did not know what I was consenting to. I did not know how much it would hurt, how alone I would be in those final moments. I know, I said gently. And I am sorry for that. I am sorry that James did not stop when he should have, that he let his ambition override his love for you. But I am asking you now, as someone who has also lost people she loved, as someone who understands the agony of being left behind, is vengeance truly what you need? Will destroying James bring you peace? Or will it simply add more pain to a world already full of it? Sir William looked at me, and I saw tears begin to form in his spectral eyes. I do not want vengeance, he said, his voice breaking. I never wanted vengeance. I simply wanted to be heard. I wanted someone to know that I suffered, that I died afraid and alone, that the last face I saw was not one of love, but one of cold scientific observation. I wanted someone to acknowledge that I mattered, that my death was not just data in a journal, but the end of a life, a real life, with all its joys and sorrows and unfinished business. You mattered, James said, and his voice was thick with tears. You mattered, Uncle William, more than anyone in my life. And I am sorry, sorrier than I can ever express, that I failed to show you that in your final moments. I was a coward and a fool, and I have spent every day since your death wishing I could go back and choose differently. I cannot undo what I did, but I can promise you that I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor your memory, not by pursuing experiments that cause suffering, but by using my knowledge to ease pain, to comfort the dying, to be present with compassion rather than absent with ambition. The ghost stood silent for a long moment, and the temperature in the room seemed to fluctuate wildly, as though he were struggling with some great internal conflict. Finally, he looked at the apparatus, at the chair with its metal bands and the strange horn-shaped speaker, and he spoke. I will sit in your machine, he said. I will let it record my testimony, but not so that the world can hear my accusations. I want the world to hear my forgiveness. I want them to know that my nephew made a terrible mistake, but that he made it out of love, out of a desperate need to prove that death is not the end. I want them to know that I forgive him, even if he cannot yet forgive himself. James's face crumpled, and he sank to his knees on the cold stone floor. Uncle, he whispered. Uncle, I do not deserve your forgiveness. Perhaps not, Sir William said, and there was a faint smile on his translucent face. But I am giving it to you nonetheless, because you were right, James. Death is not the end. I am proof of that. And if I can return, if I can speak to those I left behind, then perhaps there is hope for all of us. Perhaps love and consciousness do survive the grave, in ways we cannot yet understand. He moved to the chair and sat, his ghostly form seeming to sink into the metal framework. James struggled to his feet and moved to the apparatus, his hands shaking as he adjusted dials and checked connections. I stood to the side, my heart pounding, my eyes fixed on Sir William's face, and I prayed that this would work, that we would not simply be subjecting him to more suffering in pursuit of impossible answers. James threw the switch, and the machine hummed to life. The coils began to glow with a pale blue light, and the glass plates shimmered and flickered as though capturing images from another dimension. Sir William's form grew brighter, more solid, and I saw his mouth moving, though at first no sound came from the speaker. And then, gradually, like a phonograph warming up, his voice emerged, clear and strong and utterly recognizable. "My name is Sir William Hartley," the voice said, and though it came from the machine, it was undeniably his voice, with all its cultured precision and gentle authority. "I am speaking to you from beyond death, through an apparatus designed by my nephew, Dr. James Hartley. I want you to know that I participated willingly in his experiments. I wanted to help him prove that consciousness survives the death of the body. And though I suffered, though I died in pain and fear, I do not blame him. I blame only death itself, that great mystery we all must face. James did not murder me. He loved me. And though his love took a form that caused me suffering, it was love nonetheless. I forgive him. I release him. And I ask that the world do the same." The voice continued, speaking of the experiments, of the hope that had driven them both, of the beauty and terror of the liminal space between life and death. And as it spoke, Sir William's form began to fade, growing dimmer and more transparent with each word, as though the act of speaking were consuming what remained of his spiritual energy. James watched with tears streaming down his face, his hand on the apparatus, and I stood beside him, my own tears falling freely. And then the voice spoke its final words, and they were addressed not to the world, but to us. "Eleanor," Sir William said, and hearing my name in his voice made me gasp. "You have been kinder to me than I deserved. You have been my champion and my conscience, and I am grateful for all you have done. Take care of my nephew. Love him as I loved him, and do not let him destroy himself in pursuit of mysteries that may have no answers." "James," the voice continued, and I heard such tenderness in it, such paternal affection. "Let me go, my boy. Let me rest. You have proven what you needed to prove. Consciousness survives. Love survives. And I will be waiting for you when your time comes, not with accusations, but with open arms. Now live, James. Live and love and forgive yourself because I already have." The voice faded to silence, and Sir William's form dissipated like morning mist in sunlight, and I felt something shift in the very air of the laboratory, a sense of release, of peace, of a burden finally laid down. The machine powered down with a soft whir, and James stood staring at the empty chair, his face wet with tears, his hands still resting on the brass housing. "He is gone," James whispered. "He has finally gone." "Yes," I said, moving to stand beside him, wrapping my arms around him as he shook with silent sobs. "He is at peace now. You have given him that gift." We stood there for a long time, holding each other in the cold laboratory, surrounded by the instruments of James's ambition and failure and final, terrible success. And gradually, I felt the temperature begin to rise, felt the oppressive weight that had hung over the house begin to lift. Sir William was gone, not erased, but released, his forgiveness a benediction that freed us all. Later, much later, we emerged from the laboratory and climbed the stairs to the library. The late afternoon sun was breaking through the fog, sending shafts of golden light through the tall windows, and the room looked different somehow, lighter, as though a shadow had been lifted. James moved to the desk and carefully removed the glass plates from the apparatus, holding them up to the light. The silver emulsion was clouded with images, with patterns that might have been neural pathways or might have been something else entirely, something beyond the reach of science. "These are proof," he said quietly. "Proof that consciousness survives death, that the soul is real and measurable. I could publish them. I could present them to the Royal Society. I could claim vindication for all my theories." He looked at me, and I saw the question in his eyes. But I shook my head. "You could," I said. But what would be the point? Sir William forgave you. He gave you absolution. Do you really need the world's validation as well? James held the plates for a moment longer, and then deliberately, carefully, he carried them to the fire and dropped them in. The emulsion flared and blackened, and the glass cracked with soft popping sounds, and in moments there was nothing left but ash and fragments. No proof, no vindication, no scientific triumph to justify the suffering that had been endured. Only memory, only love, only the knowledge that we had all done our best and had finally, painfully, found our way to grace. That evening, James asked me to marry him. We were sitting in the library, watching the fire burn low, and he took my hand in his and spoke without preamble. "Eleanor," he said, "I love you more than I have ever loved anyone or anything in my life. I do not deserve you, and I cannot promise you an easy life or a respectable one. But I can promise you honesty and devotion and the knowledge that every day I wake beside you will be a gift I will never take for granted. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your love?" I did not hesitate. "Yes," I said. "Yes, James, I will marry you. Not because you need to be worthy, but because you already are. Because you had the courage to face your mistakes, to seek forgiveness, to choose compassion over ambition. Because you showed me that it is possible to love again after loss, to choose life even when death seems easier." He kissed me then, and it was gentle and fierce and full of promise, and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. We married quietly a month later, in a small chapel in Bloomsbury, with only the vicar and 2 witnesses present. I wore a simple gray silk dress, and James wore black, and we spoke our vows in voices that trembled but did not break. And when the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, I felt something settle in my chest, some part of me that had been fractured since Thomas's death, finally knitting itself back together. We left London after the wedding, selling the house in Berkeley Square and using the proceeds to establish a small medical practice in the countryside, in a village where no one knew our history or our ghosts. James devoted himself to the treatment of the poor and the dying, refusing payment from those who could not afford it, spending long hours at bedsides, offering not just medicine but comfort, presence, the kind of compassion he had failed to give his uncle. And I worked beside him, learning to assist with treatments, to comfort patients' families, to be the bridge between the living and the inevitable reality of death. We never spoke of the apparatus again. We never attempted to contact the dead or to prove the existence of the soul. We simply lived, gratefully and consciously, aware that every moment was a gift purchased at great cost. Sometimes, on winter evenings when the wind howled around our cottage and the fire burned low in the grate, I would think of Sir William. I would remember his desperate voice at my door that cold November morning, his plea for justice, his final gift of forgiveness. And I would whisper a prayer of thanks to whatever force or grace had brought us all together and allowed us to find our way through suffering to peace. And sometimes, more rarely, I would think of Thomas. I would remember the steady, quiet love he had given me, so different from the fierce passion I felt for James. And I would understand that I had been allowed to love twice in one lifetime, to know both the comfort of constancy and the exhilaration of redemption, and that both loves had been real and true and necessary to the woman I had become. One evening, perhaps a year after we had left London, James and I were walking in the garden behind our cottage, watching the sun set over the fields that stretched toward the distant hills. He had been quiet all day, lost in thought, and I had let him be, understanding that he still carried burdens I could not fully share. But now he turned to me, and there was wonder in his face and something like joy. "Eleanor," he said, "I felt him today. My uncle. Not his ghost, not his presence, but something else. A warmth, a sense of approval, as though he were watching over us and was pleased with what he saw. Do you think that is possible? Do you think the dead can still care for us, even after they have moved on?" I took his hand and squeezed it gently. "I think," I said slowly, "that love does not die. It changes, transforms, becomes something we cannot see or touch, but can still feel, like sunlight on our faces or wind in our hair. If your uncle loved you in life, then that love continues, even now, and I think he is proud of you, James. proud of the man you have become, the choices you have made, the lives you have saved." James smiled, and it was the first truly peaceful smile I had seen on his face since the day I met him. "Then I will try to be worthy of that pride," he said, "for him and for you and for all the second chances I have been given when I deserved none." We stood there in the fading light, two damaged souls who had found each other in the darkest of places and had chosen, against all odds and reason, to build a life together. And I knew that Sir William had given us more than just his forgiveness. He had given us permission to live, to love, to let go of the past and embrace the uncertain future. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I felt something I had not felt in the 3 years since Thomas died. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope that seeks to undo the past or control the future, but the quiet, steady hope that accepts what has been, makes peace with what is, and trusts that what will be might yet hold grace. I had learned that the dead can speak if we are brave enough to listen. But I had also learned that the living must eventually choose life, must turn from the shadows and walk toward the light, carrying our ghosts with us, not as burdens, but as blessings, proof that we were loved and that we loved in return. And in the end, that was justice enough. That was peace enough. That was everything.